There comes a moment in every relationship when someone realizes what they lost. And for avoidance, that moment often comes too late. You see, a super empath is not just someone who loves deeply. They are someone who understands, who gives, who shows up, even when the other person doesn't know how to receive them. But the truth is simple. When an avoidant pushes away the super empath, they think they're gaining space. But what they're really gaining is distance from the one person who ever truly saw them. And that regret, it doesn't hit all at once. It comes in powerful, undeniable moments. Moments that make them realize they didn't lose someone, they lost the rare person who made loving them look easy. Today, I want to share the 5 moments when avoidants finally feel the weight of what slipped through their fingers and why the super empath never needs to chase, beg, or explain their worth. Regret for avoidance doesn't come like a lightning strike. It arrives slowly, almost invisibly, building in moments they don't expect and in ways they don't know how to process. At first, they convince themselves that creating distance was the right choice. They lean into the familiar belief that space brings clarity and safety. For them, detaching feels like control. But what they don't realize is that the person they detached from, the super empath, was the one person who understood their complexity without judgment. And when that presence disappears, it doesn't feel freeing. It feels empty. Avoidants don't confront regret immediately because they are experts at emotional delaying. They suppress, distract, rationalize, or shift focus. But regret doesn't disappear just because someone avoids it. It simply waits for the right emotional trigger. And the first real trigger happens when they notice the absence of explanations, the kind the super empath used to offer. What they once found overwhelming suddenly becomes something they miss. They remember the way you used to communicate with patience, how you clarified misunderstandings, how you tried consistently to bridge emotional distance. You didn't just speak, you connected. You didn't just argue, you explained. For someone who fears closeness yet craves understanding, your emotional clarity was both comforting and disarming. So when they realize that you are no longer there explaining your feelings, no longer reaching out to make things right, no longer doing the emotional labor that held the relationship together, something unfamiliar stirs in them. At first, it might feel like confusion. Why aren't you trying anymore? Why aren't you seeking answers or offering them? But slowly, that confusion shifts into awareness. They begin to see that your silence isn't a tactic or punishment. It's a boundary, a decision, an act of emotional maturity they weren't prepared for. This moment is powerful because it flips the dynamic they relied on. They expected you to chase clarity, to heal miscommunications, to soften the emotional distance they created. But when you withdraw that effort, it shines a light on how much of the relationship's emotional stability came from you. They start to see that what they interpreted as clinginess or neediness wasn't desperation. It was commitment, investment, and emotional courage. They realize you weren't trying to fix them, you were trying to build something with them. And this hits them slowly, like a tide rising too gradually to notice until the water is already at their knees. The absence of your explanations becomes uncomfortable. It exposes their own inability to open up. It shows them that communication wasn't a burden. You were simply offering them a level of emotional presence they didn't know how to reciprocate at the time. And that's when regret takes root. When they recognize that the very things they pushed away were the things that kept them connected. When the silence speaks louder than your words ever did, they finally understand the depth of what they lost. When an avoidant sees you happy without them, it challenges the story they've always told themselves about you and about the relationship. In their mind, they believe that if distance ever created separation, you would be the one struggling, missing them, reaching back out, or feeling incomplete. They imagined that the emotional weight would fall on you, not them. For so long, the avoidant convinced themselves that you needed them more than they needed you, that your depth of feeling came from dependence rather than strength. But when they see you genuinely smiling, rebuilding your life, reconnecting with your passions, and rediscovering peace without their presence, something inside them shifts. It's not jealousy first, it's disbelief. Your happiness breaks the narrative they've held onto. They expected you to linger in heartbreak, to stay attached to the memory of the relationship, to keep them as the emotional center of your world. And when you don't, when you rise instead, the avoidant is forced to confront a truth they've never been prepared for. You were never emotionally fragile. You were emotionally invested. And there's a huge difference between the two. Seeing you thrive becomes the first moment where they begin to see your strength clearly. They start to understand that your empathy was never a weakness they had to manage. It was a power they didn't know how to receive. They begin to question the assumptions they made about you, the ones that made them feel safer in their avoidance. Suddenly, the image of you as someone who would cling, chase, or crumble starts to fall apart. Instead, they see someone emotionally resilient, someone who took the pain, processed it, and used it as a catalyst for growth. And that's when regret starts to seep in. Not because you're happy, your happiness was always deserved. The regret comes because your happiness makes them realize how wrong they were about the role they played in your life. They weren't the anchor, they were the interruption. They weren't the reason for your stability, they were the obstacle you overcame. And knowing this shakes the internal comfort they relied on for so long. When they see you laughing again, connecting with friends, pursuing goals, or simply living with a lightness that wasn't present when you were trying to hold the relationship together, they're confronted with the possibility that you didn't lose something. They did. They start to recognize that the peace you now have was the peace you were trying to create with them. They understand that the joy you display isn't about replacing them. It's about reclaiming parts of yourself that dimmed when you were trying to love someone who couldn't meet you emotionally. Happiness becomes your silent announcement that you've outgrown the cycle. And that realization stings because avoidants rarely expect the person they pushed away to outgrow the dynamic. They expect waiting, longing, or emotional dependency. But what they see instead is transformation. You evolved, you expanded, you didn't break, you broke open. Their regret deepens when they realize your happiness has nothing to do with making them jealous. You're not performing, you're not proving, you're simply living in a way that shows you finally chose yourself. And that choice highlights the difference between the two of you. You confronted your emotions and they avoided theirs. You healed while they stayed stuck. You grew while they stayed guarded. Your happiness is the proof that the story they believed was wrong. And once that truth lands, it's impossible for them to ignore what losing you really meant. There comes a moment when life catches up to the avoidant, when the very emotions they've pushed down, denied, or minimized begin to surface. It might be triggered by stress, loneliness, conflict, or simply a quiet night when their mind stops racing long enough for them to feel something real. In those moments, they instinctively reach for the emotional support they once received so effortlessly from the super empath, not because they suddenly want to reconnect, but because that support had become an unspoken comfort in their life, something they didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. Avoidants often tell themselves they don't need anyone. Independence becomes their armor, and self-reliance becomes their identity. But what they fail to realize is that the emotional presence you offered was not a threat to their independence. It was a soft place to land. You provided understanding without pressure, compassion without expectation, and reassurance without demanding anything in return. You gave them emotional safety even when they didn't have the language or courage to ask for it. And because you did it so naturally, they never recognized the depth of what you offered. They assumed it would always be there. But when that support disappears, the void becomes undeniable. Suddenly, the little things they used to take for granted become painfully noticeable. The messages that once grounded them during a stressful day are missing. The emotional clarity you provided during misunderstandings is gone. The way you made chaos feel manageable has vanished. They find themselves navigating emotions on their own, not because they prefer it, but because they no longer have access to the person who made those moments easier. This is where regret begins to bloom. They start remembering the times you listened without judgment, the way you gently encouraged growth, the way you brought calm to their internal storms. They replay moments when you tried to emotionally connect and realize they were the ones who resisted out of fear. They see now that your emotional support wasn't too much. It was exactly what they needed, but couldn't admit at the time. And with that realization comes an ache. Not only did they lose you, they lost the emotional safety net you created for them. What makes this regret even deeper is that they know they can't simply reach out and expect the same response anymore. You're not there waiting with open arms. You're not rescuing them from their emotional discomfort. You've stepped back, and in doing so, you've forced them to face the emotions they've been avoiding all along. They begin to understand how much effort you put into supporting them, effort they never matched, effort they sometimes dismissed, effort they often misunderstood as pressure rather than love. When life gets heavy and the one person who knew how to calm their internal storms is no longer available, they start to recognize the true value of your presence. They remember how you handled their emotional shutdowns, how you stayed patient when they ran, how you always approached them with compassion instead of criticism. That kind of emotional generosity is rare. And once they experience the coldness of facing life without it, they realize just how deeply they depended on your warmth. This regret doesn't come as a dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly, often in the private moments they don't talk about, late at night, during moments of vulnerability, when they face challenges that once felt easier simply because you were there. And as they sit with that emptiness, they finally understand that the emotional support they once overlooked was not a given. It was a gift they can no longer access, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally chose to care for yourself. The avoidants often live with the illusion that emotional depth is a burden. They tell themselves that too much feeling, too much care, too much vulnerability is overwhelming, not because it truly is, but because they've never learned how to feel safely around another person. So when they walk away from a super empath, they often assume they're leaving behind intensity, drama, or emotional pressure. What they don't realize is that they're walking away from a kind of love that most people never experience in their lifetime. The moment this becomes clear is usually when they start connecting with other people. At first, everything seems lighter, easier, less emotionally demanding. But as time goes on, they notice something missing, something subtle but undeniable. The conversations feel surface level, the emotional bond doesn't deepen, the connection lacks the spark, the intuition, the sense of being truly seen. They may get attention, affection, or companionship, but they don't get resonance, they don't get the feeling of being understood without having to explain every corner of their mind. They don't get the sense of emotional safety that once came so naturally with you. Avoidants are rarely prepared for the moment when comparison begins. They didn't expect to contrast the way someone new responds with the way you responded, with patience, empathy, clarity, and depth. They didn't expect to notice that other people don't sense their moods, don't anticipate their emotional needs, and don't offer reassurance before they even have to ask. They start to see that the qualities they once took for granted, your emotional intelligence, your intuition, your consistency, are not common at all. They were rare. You were rare. And gradually the truth sinks in. The love they walked away from wasn't overwhelming. It was exceptional. The emotional connection wasn't too much. It was exactly the level of depth their heart needed, even if their fear made it difficult to accept at the time. They begin to realize that the super empath didn't love them in a clingy or demanding way. They loved them in a way that was healing, grounding, and elevating. They offered a love that pulled the avoidant out of emotional isolation, even if only for a moment. One of the most painful realizations for the avoidant is that emotional depth can't be manufactured. It has to come from a genuine bond, a mutual understanding, a natural energetic alignment, the kind you brought effortlessly. They start to see that while many people can offer affection, very few can offer connection. Many can offer companionship, but few can offer emotional sanctuary. And even fewer can love with the same kind of devotion and strength that a super empath brings into a relationship. This realization often comes in small but piercing moments. Maybe it's during a conversation with someone new that falls flat emotionally. Maybe it's when they try to open up a little and are met with confusion instead of understanding. Maybe it's when they feel vulnerable and realize they don't have anyone who knows how to hold that vulnerability without judgment. Or maybe it's when they reflect on the past and begin to see the ways you consistently showed up, even when they didn't. What makes this moment of regret particularly deep is that it forces them to confront a truth they didn't want to acknowledge. Losing you wasn't just losing a partner. It was losing a type of love they may never experience again. They realized that what they once perceived as intensity was actually authenticity. What they once saw as emotional closeness was actually safety. And the person they thought would always be there is now gone, living a life where their exceptional love is appreciated by someone else or by themselves first. The avoidant begins to recognize that you didn't love like everyone else. You loved with depth, loyalty, intuition, and emotional courage. You offered what most people can't. And once they feel the absence of that level of connection, they finally understand the magnitude of what they lost. There is a specific moment that hits an avoidant harder than any other, the realization that you're not coming back. Not because you're angry, not because you're trying to prove a point, and not because you're waiting for them to chase you. You're simply gone in a way they never believed you would be. For so long, avoidants operate under the quiet assumption that no matter how much distance they create, no matter how many times they pull away, the super empath will always return. They believe you will always initiate the healing, restart the conversation, or rebuild the connection. In their mind, you are the emotional anchor, reliable, forgiving, endless in your capacity to understand. They assume your love is permanent, unconditional to the point of inevitability. But that belief starts to crumble when they see that you've truly moved on. Not with another person necessarily, but with yourself. When you no longer react to their absence, when you no longer check in, when you stop waiting for closure or change, it sends a message they never expected. Your heart has drawn a line, and for once, it's on your terms. This kind of detachment from a super empath isn't cold or dramatic. It's peaceful. It's purposeful. It's the result of emotional exhaustion turned into emotional clarity. And that clarity creates a boundary so strong that even the avoidant feels it. At first, they may dismiss it as temporary. They tell themselves you just need space, that you'll eventually reach out again. They cling to old patterns because those patterns made them feel safe. But as more time passes and the silence remains unbroken, a different sensation begins to settle in. Unease. Unease grows into discomfort. Discomfort grows into awareness, and then awareness grows into regret. This regret isn't just about losing you. It's about realizing they took your presence for granted. They begin to understand that you didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you finally recognized your own value. That truth is what stings the most. Avoidants don't fear losing love. They fear losing the person who made loving them possible. And when they realize that the door they shut, the door they thought could be reopened any time, is now locked from your side, they feel the weight of that loss in a way they've never felt anything before. They start replaying the relationship in their mind, noticing all the moments where you tried, where you were patient, where you chose understanding over defensiveness. They remember how many opportunities they had to meet you halfway and didn't. They think about the times they pushed you away and believed you'd simply bounce back. And now, facing the reality that you're no longer willing to play that role, they're confronted with the consequences of their emotional avoidance. What makes this realization so powerful is that avoidants rarely expect permanence in loss. They expect cycles. They expect second chances. But when they feel your emotional departure, steady, grounded, and final, they recognize that they have run out of time. They understand that they were loved deeply by someone extraordinary, someone who tried far longer than most people ever would. And once they see that you've chosen to walk forward without looking back, they understand the truth they avoided all along. You didn't leave because you gave up on them. You left because you finally chose yourself. In the end, the greatest lesson in losing a super empath is realizing that love is not guaranteed just because it was once freely given, and the avoidance regret comes from understanding too late what they pushed away out of fear. When you step into your strength, reclaim your peace, and choose yourself, you show that the story doesn't end with loss. It ends with transformation. Thank you for listening, for honoring your own emotional journey, and for recognizing that the love you carry is powerful, rare, and always worth protecting.